Administrator, with regard to the functional needs support I mentioned in my opening statement, services guidance I referenced in my opening statement, can you please clarify when this guidance applies? Does it apply to emergency sheltering during disaster, long-term shelters after disaster, or both? How are you working with emergency management officials on this issue to ensure that they continue to be able to serve the people in their area?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. With the functional shelter needs guidance that was placed, that we put out, this is actually based upon the program that was utilized in Texas to ensure that their shelters were accessible. And there's been a couple of more recent developments that occurred from the Department of Justice. Most recently, the City of Los Angeles was held in violation of the American Disabilities Act for not being inclusive with the public that has disabilities in their programs. So we're trying to provide this information in such a way that it complies with Department of Justice guidance and their interpretations of how the American with Disabilities Act would apply to sheltering. But we're also recognizing that particularly in Florida's case, but along the Gulf Coast, you have a situation where you have evacuation shelters which are very short-term, are not really designed to provide long-term accommodations and care versus those shelters that may be set up after the disaster. And I think there are some areas there when you look at the issue of reasonable accommodation that those things can be addressed. But it comes back to a very fundamental concept, and that is when we open up an emergency shelter for an evacuation and a disaster, we should not find ourselves in a situation that we would turn people away merely because they presented with a disability and had to go to another special facility. But when it comes to some of the longer term support, I think those are areas that you can work on, but you really have to start off with the idea of, if I'm using a shelter that's not accessible in the first place, is there another better location I can use? You know, we use primarily in many of the Gulf Coast states the public school systems as those shelters. And as you remember, in Florida legislature provided lots of funding to harden those shelters. But they don't always have the bathrooms or the shower facilities for longer term accommodations. And those are the kind of things that we need to look through and look at. But to turn somebody away because they present with a disability is one of our primary concerns, that how do we get to where we're not having to do that? To be short on this and to give you more time for questions, one of the things that we've looked at in FEMA is we used to have two different types of cots: regular cots for general population shelters, and then what we call special needs cots. What we're trying to move towards, and we are putting out bids for and looking for the specs now to get a manufacturer in the U.S. to build them, is go to a universal cot so that you don't have to differentiate. It's a cot that's high enough and stable enough that if somebody needed to self-transfer from a wheelchair, they can do it. But it also means that instead of trying to maintain two separate inventories, we go to one device that's universal and is inclusive. We're not there either. We're having to work and budget and build this into our capabilities. But these guidelines essentially provide us that roadmap to get there. So when it comes down to in that emergency phase, I think there's more work we can do with local governments on what that reasonableness is, but it cannot start with the discussion that we're going to turn people away from a shelter because we can't accommodate them, send them somewhere else based upon they present with a disability. It has to be based upon what are those needs going to be in the first 24 to 48 hours versus a longer term shelter where they may be there for a week or more.
But you'll continue to work with us on this issue and as well as the local?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.